Hello, my name is Tim Shoebridge. In this video, I'm going to be giving you my thoughts on this synthesizer here. It's the Mighty Pro 2 from Sequential. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. You're thinking, I'm a little bit late to the party on this one, aren't I? And you're absolutely right. It's taken me 8 years to finally get my hands on one of these. So what I'm going to do in this video is give you my thoughts on the Pro 2 when I heard about it, when it was first released 8 years ago, and give you my thoughts now I've finally got my hands on one. So why did it take me so long to get a Pro 2? Well, the reason for that is quite simple, and that is when it was announced, I quickly made up my mind that I didn't need one. It was as simple as that, and there were two basic reasons for this. The first reason was that it's a monosynth, and I just wasn't in the market for a monosynth at that time. I mean, monosynths are quite common. They come in all different shapes and sizes. There's a huge variety to choose from. And I did actually own a few monosynths at the time, and I just didn't really need yet another monosynth. That's the first reason. But the main reason was that for me, very, very personally, when I looked at the spec sheet of the Pro 2 and I heard people talking about it, it just seemed to be so similar to another synth that I already owned. So for that reason alone, there was no need for a Pro 2 in my life. I'm going to cover both of these two reasons in some detail next. So the Pro 2 is fundamentally a monosynth. That is, it is a one note at a time synthesizer. Yes, it can play paraphonically, but that's not particularly unusual for a monosynth. The lowly Dreadbox Erebus version 1, that was released at a similar kind of time as the Pro 2. It's only got two oscillators, but you can play them paraphonically. In other words, duophonically, with just a flick of a switch. Then you've got, say, the Novation Base Station 2, the Waldorf Pulse 2, the Moog Subsequent 37 I've got here behind me, the massive and mighty Arturia Matrix Brute. These are all examples, or just a few examples, of many monosynths that can play paraphonically. Oh yeah, and you've got here, down in the shadows, the Monopoly from Behringer. This plays paraphonically so well that it's kind of turned it into a full-time career. Now, when the Pro 2 was first announced and the marketing engine kicked in, they marketed it as one voice to rule them all. And they also called it the most powerful monosynth ever. That's quite a claim, isn't it? And I think that it kind of raised expectations quite high. I mean, don't get me wrong, the Pro 2 is bulging with features. It really is bulging with features. But I'm kind of wondering how many features you need in a monosynth most of the time. I mean, what I mean by that is, if you listen to, your favorite tracks, your favorite music, and you listen to where monosynths are being used, then they're generally being used for three types of sound. They're being used for basses, for leads, and for repeating sequences and arpeggios and that kind of thing. And when you listen to your favorite tracks and you hear where monosynths are being used, I would say that most of the time, those patches are really quite simple. You might need one or two oscillators, one or two envelope generators. You'll want a really good sounding filter for sure. Maybe just one LFO will do. Patches are generally quite simple 99% of the time when monosynths are being used. The thing for me is with a monosynth that the sound, the raw sound of that synth is far more important than a large collection of capabilities and modulation sources and destinations and that kind of thing. I'd like to know from you, what is your favorite monosynth? Maybe it's a synth that you used to own but don't anymore, or maybe it's a synth that you still own. What is that synth? I'd be really interested to know what it is. But I'm kind of guessing that it's most likely to be an analog synth, and it's most likely to be quite a simple architecture. Now, don't get me wrong, the Pro 2 is far more than just a monosynth. It is bulging with features, and in that regard, it reminds me so much of another synth that I do own, and that is what I'm going to talk about next. So what is this other synth that I'm thinking about? Now, I'm thinking that you're thinking that I'm thinking of the Prophet 12. And yes, they do have a lot in common. I did own a Prophet 12 for quite a while, and there's definitely a lot of Prophet 12 DNA inside the Pro 2. But actually, I'm thinking of a different synthesizer to the Prophet 12. I'm thinking of a synthesizer that was released about 20 years ago now. But it was made by Dave. It was made by Dave Smith. I'm thinking of the Evolver.
Hi, this is Dave Smith. I'm here with my latest instrument, Evolver. Evolver is what I like to call a stereo monophonic instrument. It's monophonic in that it's a single voice instrument like a classic analog synth. But it's stereo. It's got a complete stereo signal path, so there's actually two of everything inside.
Now, the Evolver came in 4 different versions. 2 of them were monosynths and 2 were polysynths. But apart from the polyphony and the different form factors, they all share the exact same synth architecture. If I was to choose one of them to compare against the Pro 2, it would be this one here, the Mono Evolver keyboard, or MEK as we call it in the trade. So why do I think that the MEK and the Pro 2 are so alike? Well, they both have 4 oscillators, they both have 4 LFOs, they both have complex modulation sequencing capabilities, they both have a dedicated distortion circuit, they both have a dedicated tuned feedback circuit, they both have a dedicated multi-tap delay circuit with feedback in, and they both have some sound decimation, some grunge capability, and they both are hybrid synths. They have digital oscillators, although the Evolver has a couple of analog ones as well, and they both have analog filters, although the Evolver has a digital high-pass filter. So the Evolver is a little bit more hybrid actually than the Pro 2 in that regard. Now, the one piece of DNA from the Evolver that didn't make its way into the Pro 2, and I think that's a big shame, is the Evolver's stereo capability. The Evolver really is a stereo monster. It's got stereo in the signal path all the way from the oscillators all the way through to the outputs. Stereo is what the Evolver is all about to me personally. Whereas with the Pro 2, it's a mono signal chain all the way to just at the very, very end. At the very, very end of the Pro 2 signal chain, you can then pan left and right, and you can also pan the digital delay left and right as well. And that's about it. And for me, when I'm playing the Pro 2 paraphonically, playing chords with it basically, everything sounds just a little bit flat to my ears, a little bit lifeless. And I think that that, for me personally, is because of the lack of stereo width within the sound itself. There's no such thing as a pan spread because we're only dealing with one voice. Remember, we've got 4 oscillators that we can play at the same time, but it's just the one voice. So there's no pan spread going on in there. There's no stereo filter capability, even though we've got 2 filters. It's a little bit of a shame that we don't have stereo a little bit further up the signal path inside the Pro 2. Now, coming back to the Evolver, I don't think it ever really made it into the big time as a monosynth. I think it was just rather too complex and a little bit left field for most people. And I think that that's kind of similar with the Pro 2 as well. I mean, the Evolver did cement itself in many people's hearts as being a fantastic sound design tool, not a monosynth. And I think that the Pro 2 has got a very similar experience. Okay, so I'm going to spare you the audio from this segment, but what I'm doing here is doing some sound comparisons between the Pro 2 and the subsequent 37, trying to create patches that sound exactly the same on both synths. Now, they're never going to sound exactly the same. The responses from the envelopes are different, the filters sound different, the oscillators sound different. They're never going to sound exactly the same, but I am impressed actually. The Pro 2 does a very good job of regular sounding basses and leads. If you're using just a couple of oscillators, an LFO, and one of the filters, you can get some pretty nice bass sounds out of it. It stacks up pretty well against the subsequent 37, I think. Now the thing is, I think that the subsequent 37 is a far more approachable synthesizer. It is actually quite complicated. There's an awful lot going on in there. In that subsequent 37, there's a lot of little buttons that you can press and access some advanced features. But if you ignore those buttons and you just concentrate on those knobs, it's a very approachable and fairly straightforward looking interface. And I think that's really important for a standard monosynth to be quite approachable. And I think maybe that is a downside of the Pro 2. You do have 4 oscillators, you've got 5 envelopes, you've got 4 LFOs, there's an awful lot there. There is some menu diving that you have to do for some fairly standard parameters, to be honest with you, and I don't think that the Pro 2 is quite as approachable. If I've got any criticisms at all about the Pro 2 for standard basses and leads, it is that I'm not quite happy with the response of the knobs. They are potentiometers, but they kind of jump a bit. As soon as you touch them, the sort of values jump a bit. And I find that it's really quite hard to dial in the subtle amounts of envelope generator modulation that I want to use with a filter. It's really quite difficult to get the values that I like. I like the response of the Moog synth much better. Maybe that's because I'm more used to it, but that's possibly the case. But I do feel that there's a little bit of sort of jumpiness with the knobs, with the potentiometers on the Pro 2. Now, at this point in the video, I'm sure by now all of you Pro 2 lovers out there are seething at me. How dare I criticize this beautiful instrument? I know I'm being very critical, so please try and stay calm. I'm mentioning things that I do think are worth mentioning because at the end of the day, the Pro 2 will definitely not be for everybody. But for those of you who it is for, I do 101% understand why you love this synthesizer. As a very proud Evolver owner myself, I get it. I get what it is about this synth that you do love. You know, there is a lifetime of sound design capabilities inside this little synth here. A lifetime of it. I think, you know, it gets you as far as you can with a sort of like a standalone monosynth with a keyboard before you might actually want to get involved in semi-modular 2600 style programming or have a full modular rig. It is really an amazing synth for sound design capabilities, but come on, let's face it, it is a little bit of a paradox. So why do I call the Pro 2 a paradox? Well, for me, it's a monosynth, but it's not an obvious choice of monosynth. It's a paraphonic synth, but it's not an obvious choice of paraphonic synth either. It's actually a wavetable synth, but it's also not an obvious choice of wavetable synth. And we haven't talked about it in this video, but you can integrate it with your Eurorack. It's got lots of CVs, ins and outs. So it's a synth that you can integrate with Eurorack, but it's not the obvious choice of synth to integrate with Eurorack either. I think, you know, the true strength of the Pro 2 lies in the details. It lies in the spec sheet. It lies in the 51 different modulation sources and 142 modulation destinations. You know, if you have the patience to master the Pro 2, if sound design and experimentation with sound is what really interests you, then that is why you're going to love this synth to pieces and why it's probably going to be the last synth you'll ever part with. That's all I've got time for. I do hope this video has in some way been informative or interesting. Please hit the like button if you've liked it. Please consider subscribing to my channel if you haven't already. Until the next video, as always, thank you very, very much for watching.